Good evening. It is the 6th of April. This is Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. Welcome to the show. Tonight's program we're going to be discussing the French presidential election as the French electorate heads to the polls on this coming Sunday in a vote that is going to be extremely crucial not only for the future of France but indeed for the European Union. Simon, tell us a little bit about why this is so significant.
Reagan, it's good to see you tonight. Firstly, it's great to be with you all tonight for tonight's programme. Because we're based in Britain and because our news is completely dominated pretty much by the war in Ukraine, our media and our mainstream media is not focusing so much on the French presidential elections. But what we have at stake is the destiny of Europe, depending on the outcome of the French presidential election. The first round will take place on Sunday, followed by the second round 2 weeks later, I think on Sunday, the 24th of April. So we have a globalist and a federalist in Emmanuel Macron, who's the current incumbent, and he's seeking a second term as a French president. No French president has done this for 20 years, not since Jacques Chirac won the French presidential elections back in 2002, has a French president won a second term. He's up against a candidate in Marine Le Pen, who was formerly of the National Front, the ultra right-wing nationalist party. She seems to have moderated her appearance, her attitude, her policies. And she's running Macron close. So what is effectively at stake is either Europe with Macron goes full acceleration into a United States of Europe, or if Marine Le Pen surprises everyone, wins the election, which will be the equivalent of a political earthquake all across Europe, if not across the world, will then put the foot brakes on the acceleration towards a European superstate. She's already stated that she wants French sovereignty over French law to be more superior than European law, which effectively can't happen because that's not how the EU operates.
Exactly.
So effectively in this election coming up, we can see either an acceleration towards a European superstate or full brakes on this European project, even to the prospect that Marine Le Pen could actually bring about a referendum in France to give the French people an option of whether they want to remain in the EU or not. So there is a huge amount at stake in this election, and I'm very concerned also that the underbelly of support for Marine Le Pen is still strongly anti-Semitic elements within the party that she hasn't completely got rid of. So, you know, this is very much as a very, very polarizing presidential election that we are seeing coming up. And this is why it's so important. And as the first round takes place on Sunday, it's important that we have an understanding of what's happening, because what happens in France and what happens in Europe affects us here in Britain. Because, of course, we went to war against Napoleon, against Germany twice in the last century. And Europe does pose an existential threat. And we know that Emmanuel Macron is very anti-Brexit and he's not a fan of Boris Johnson whatsoever.
Absolutely. If you look at this particular election, in many ways, we're just having a repeat of what we experienced 5 years ago. We're just a little bit more clued up on who the runners in this race are. Macron 5 years ago, very fresh-faced, 39 years of age, the youngest leader of France since Napoleon himself. Many people questioned whether or not he was the right man for the job, whether or not he'd be able to lead France through in a very difficult world environment at the moment, with a lot of crises in France at the time and leading up to it. Would he be the right man for the job? He's an ex-banker, he's a pro-EU integrationist, but he did benefit from weak opposition in 2017. Yes, Marine Le Pen did give him a good run. It was something that was only decided in the final round and the runoff, but Macron was voted in. An interesting man. He's married to a 68-year-old woman for his senior.
School teacher as well.
His school teacher as well. You know, there was some question over that relationship at the time, and certainly the tabloids had a field day with him becoming the French president. His tactic for this election, a classic for any incumbent, has been to remain above the fray. And indeed, it has been just that. It has been a fray. We're talking about mass social cohesion problems, Islamic extremism. Look at all of the nations across the EU, and it's very hard to get away from identifying France as the primary problem place for Islamic extremism. We have routinely arson attacks on churches. Many of these are not exposed to be fully what they are, but strongly linked to Islamic extremism. Also, we've had attacks, not just on normal, common populace. We've had Islamic attacks on priests in services in churches.
And a beheading of a school teacher a few years ago.
Indeed.
We've also seen really that period between 2015 to about 2017, we saw a huge wave of Islamic extremist attacks. And so what's happening now, which is really interesting, is that Marine Le Pen has moderated her language now, and Macron's political party are actually labelling of being too soft on confronting Islamic extremism within the country, which is incredible. So his attempt to label Marine Le Pen as a right-wing extremist, racist, is not working with the French public, because she seems to be very, very successful in actually changing her spots and her appearance, moderating her views. Apparently there was a documentary about her home in France, and she's single, she loves cats, and it was all about her love for cats. So
there we go. So trying to portray a natural, normal appearance to the common populace, which is something that they'll warm to. Definitely an image rebrand from 5 years ago. Now, Macron has some other issues that he has to stay above as well, including France's response to COVID was seen by many to be quite extreme. It did extend. And so there will be some people, perhaps, who voted for Macron who will have become disenchanted with him and want change at this time. Certainly, across the world, we're seeing a lot of economic fallout, a lot of problems as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in elections, that does have a role. You don't look at what other countries are experiencing and say, hey, we're all in it together. You look at what you're facing and whether or not there's someone who's offering a better solution. So economic problems, rising inflation. France has the same issue with energy provisions that we do. Their bills are going up. There's criticism that he is facing over his response to all of these crises in the past couple of years. We even saw early on in his term that there were these protests. They lasted for 5 months, I believe. 5 months. Yellow vest protest. Extreme behavior on the streets protesting his decision making.
What's also interesting about Macron, for example, is that while all the other candidates, and we'll go through the list of candidates shortly that are standing in the French presidential election, but he hasn't engaged in any TV debates. He virtually was very, very late in declaring his candidacy to run a second term. He wants to look presidential on the world stage and feels his priority now is to try and negotiate with Putin to try and stop the conflict in the Ukraine. So he's trying to act presidential, this is party politics, I'm above all this. But in terms of the power, he's obsessed with power because there's, I've got it written down, but there is a French historian that says that the French president has more power than any other executive branch around the world of any Western democracy. But Macron himself is obsessed with power, and trying to use as much gusto as he can in order to use that power as much as he can, which in France has got a history, of course, of the French Revolution. The French people love their liberté and their freedoms. And of course, the policies that he's introduced, as they see it, are kind of more authoritarian in nature.
Indeed.
So of course, this could be a backlash. He hasn't really campaigned at all. And so we don't even know how well he'll do in the first round. He's expected to go into the second round, probably with Marine Le Pen, but he hasn't campaigned.
This is a danger for him, and I guess we'll see after Sunday just how well risk-taking has paid off for him. He may be thinking, well, the less I say, the less I appear in these debates, the better chance I have of not making some gaffe or slipping up. But people do take notice of that sort of thing. You can look and you can say, in the US election as well, Biden did not take part in a lot of opportunities that he normally would have been expected to. So you can look and ask whether or not the left is just so confident and cocky in its own position.
I think there's a lot of arrogance there.
Yeah, definitely.
I do think there's a lot of arrogance there. But, you know, for example, with President Zelensky in the Ukraine, he won the election purely on social media. Which is incredible. Just short 2 or 3 minute videos on Facebook and YouTube and everything else, and that managed to convince the Ukrainian people to vote for him. So in the same way, I'm not quite sure how this election is going. I think it's more of a traditional presidential election. But let's just have a look at and remind ourselves of some of the issues that occurred 5 years ago, back in 2017, when the fresh-faced Emmanuel Macron won the French presidential elections of 2017.
Euphoria, Macron actually promised to unite France, which for a French president is like trying to herd cats. This leftist said Macron's stage show was a success. Extreme finance has won. But Le Pen was magnanimous in defeat.
I called Mr. Macron to congratulate him on being elected. And I believe in the main interest of the country, and therefore I wished success to him.
Le Pen's National Front party announced it would rebrand and change its name.
Be able to represent a wider scope of sovereignty, leaders and movements around the patriotic idea.
The European establishment and media who helped prop up the European Union breathed a collective sigh of relief that the nationalist Le Pen went down in flames. But this could still be a bad year for the EU. Italian elections could see an anti-Euro movement become the biggest party. Greek finances could damage the value of the euro. Macron has promised to reform the sick French economy, but reform attempts in France are usually met with burning barricades. President Trump tweeted, "Congratulations to Emmanuel Macron on his big win today as the next president of France. I look very much forward to working with you."
So that's a blast from the past. 5 years ago. We'll see what the report is produced, I suppose, next week. After the initial run, but then the 24th of April for the final. We have an email here. Hi guys, after the resounding re-election of President Orban last week, a win for Le Pen would show that populism isn't dead yet. And if the Republicans take the House and Senate next year, then maybe the insane policies of the left can be turned back. That's from Johnny. And who knows? I mean, it seems like we are seeing some sort of resurgence. Maybe these things go in cycles. We often do see people think, okay, well, maybe we'll have try a little bit of that, a little bit of the left wing, and then we realize, oh, it promises a lot. It doesn't give that much. It gives very, very little. Now, one of the things you mentioned, Simon, that France is known for being very revolutionary and everything, but one of the interesting things is that it has never actually had a female president. It's a very revolutionary place, overly progressive in many ways, but it hasn't actually had a female president. And so Marine Le Pen would actually become the first female president should she win this upcoming election. And if she does, indeed, it will completely transform not only France, but will go a long way. We can easily see in 5 years that it could also play a big part in reshaping the whole of the EU.
Of course, particularly on immigration policy, and this is something that the French are most concerned about, is the mass wave of immigration into their country, which is an EU policy, which has brought, with the Schengen Agreement, nothing but kind of terrorism, and creates huge social problems in France. So we got no-go areas, particularly in Marseille and other areas of France as well. And the French feel that there's a battle for their identity, and this is what they're trying to fight. They hoped that President Emmanuel Macron would bring about reforms, he would modernise the country, but he hasn't been able to do so, and this is why there's a lot of anger amongst French voters concerning the way that he has actually presided over France and governed France. So what's interesting as well with the French political system is that the president has almost absolute power in France. So he makes the big decisions, and he also makes the small decisions as well. So of course, when things are like at street level or local council level or small village level or town level, it almost has to go right through the president in order to get that authorization to get anything done. And one interesting thing about France as well is that domestically you can have a say on domestic policy in France, but no one can have any influence over French foreign policy whatsoever. Almost impossible.
It's fascinating insights there, Simon. We have from Digby here. As a French national and primarily Christian, Marine Le Pen wouldn't get my vote if she was anti-Semitic. However, I did research this before the last election. She has interviews on YouTube for all to see denouncing anti-Semitism and actively employs Jewish people within her party. She should not be slated for her father's views. In France, we start with 12 candidates in the first round and end up with 2 candidates for the second round. So in the final vote, we could be voting for a candidate we're not happy with. As we say, we vote with a peg on our nose. God bless and keep up the good work. Thank you very much, Digby in Southampton. And I assume you're going to be voting in the election as a French national. Feel free to write back and tell us a little bit more of your perspective on this, but very, very helpful comments. And indeed, this is how Marine Le Pen has been painted, Simon. She's been painted as far right. That's the language used. But then we are aware of how very often our media can paint people in this particular way. And you analyze their policies and you think, not so sure about that. I mean, we've had David Curtin in the studio on multiple occasions, and David would be considered by many people far right. David's not at all far right. He simply is a man who has Christian values. And so, and he would seek to vote on those and did when he was part of the Greater London Assembly.
Yeah, but we have to understand, I think, Digby, I think, makes some very interesting points, but I think we also have to recognise the hardcore support within her party, the National Front Party, which she's now changed to, I think, the National Rally Party. So she's given a overall complete name change. Done a very similar thing with what Tony Blair did with the Labour Party by calling it New Labour. Got rid of Clause 4 and some major decisions within the party to kind of modernise it, to give it a kind of fresh look. But in reality, there's still those core supporters that hold deeply anti-Semitic views, and that's where her father came from, who was very much supportive of the Vichy France in the Second World War, and there was some collaboration there with the Nazis, and his hatred for the Jewish community was obvious, and so this is why the Jewish community is extremely fearful of Marine Le Pen even today. So it's a question of whether, if she wins the election, whether she holds to the moderation or not, or whether she uses this as like a Trojan horse in order to get power and then implement some very extreme, dangerous policies. Now, look, I support the concept of Frexit. You know, the French people having their own vote on whether they want to be part of the European Union or not. I completely support that. And I think that's encouraging. I think France has to deal with the issues of its mass immigration problems, particularly coming from North Africa and Islamic countries, that is changing the nature and the character of French society. But the thing is, though, there's a big difference between our nation and the French nation, because the French had the revolution, they got rid of their monarchies when was the French Revolution? 1789. That changed a whole set of course of history, which led to the rise of Napoleon and a lot of these secular humanist ideas that are the ideas behind the European Union came out of Napoleon's ideas. So we have to think that France is playing a way in trying to move the world into more of a humanistic, globalist agenda. So if, for example, there was a president in France who could just put the brakes on that for a little bit, we'd see a transformation not only in the West but around the world. And I think France is a great nation, has a fantastic culture, fantastic history, but there is so much at stake at this election.
There's a lot across Europe that we can look at and say is similar country to country. And one of the things that I find similar, it was mentioned in one of the emails earlier about Viktor Orban's victory. And, you know, the elections that have just taken place in Hungary have also had that element of concern among the Jewish community who felt, okay, there's some rootings and some singularly unpleasant ideologies that come across anyway as anti-Semitic in Viktor Orban's grouping. But then what are the alternatives? And so the Jews in Hungary were very, very torn between where to go and who to vote for. I think in many ways we're probably going to see something similar occur in France. And it's doubtless of extreme concern. We've talked on the program before about the rise in anti-Semitic attacks in France. There's massive. A lot of France's Jews making Aliyah because of that. And so this is a tense time, and we do need to bear that in mind and to be praying for it. Digby, do get back if you have some further thoughts on that anti-Semitic element would be.
My kind of viewpoint is I'll wait and see. I'm very sceptical. I'm not a sceptical person, but on this issue with Marine Le Pen, I'm very sceptical.
Ian says, thank you for your great program. So much happening now, indeed, and there is much to pray for. Simon, let's talk a little bit before we go to our interview about the other incumbents, the others who are going to be seeking to challenge for the presidency. There's someone who's an extreme leftist, Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
He was very supportive of Putin until the war in Ukraine, and he's had to change tactics.
Yeah, fascinating.
And he wanted to pull France out of NATO as well.
So this guy, he's a controversial leftist. He's experienced late surge in polls as various right-wing candidates have seen their campaigns falter, which is very interesting because that seems to indicate that there are people moving over from far right type groups over to this guy who's an extreme leftist. But according to him, inflation and rising prices have become the biggest issues facing the French people today. So I suppose part of the reason that people might be swapping to him is if he thinks he has a solution to put more money in people's pocketbooks, that is an attractive proposal. His policies include price controls, a 32-hour work week, and an official pension age of 60. Were he to reach the runoff, it would be the first time since 2012 that a left-wing candidate would do so. Despite the recent surge in his polling, though, political commentators are doubtful of his ability to fend off Macron.
I could see France going to the economic abyss with those policies.
Yep.
We also have, for example, the French have a candidate who's been described as the Trump candidate, known as Eric Zemmour, who's Jewish. It says Eric Zemmour at the moment is in the spotlight, appears to be on the face of it dwindling. He was turning heads on both sides of the channel for several reasons early in his campaign. Zemmour, a former TV presenter who came to prominence due to his strongly anti-immigration viewpoints has dwindled in the polls recently as Le Pen has surged once again, and Macron's popularity has been boosted in wake of the war in the Ukraine. He also landed himself in a lot of hot water as he failed to hear and suppress the chants of Macron assassination to one of his campaign rallies. And also with him as well, that he is considered very much a conservative, would win very much of the conservative Catholic vote in this presidential election.
We do have a conservative, Valérie Pécresse, the candidate for the centre-right Les Républicains, has failed to attract support that many had expected, perhaps hoped for. Les Républicains, formerly known as UMP, are the traditional centre-right party of France, who for many years competed exclusively with the centre-left party, Parti Socialiste, for power. Now, both parties are out of favour. Macron has been in vogue, at least for the past 5 years, and his group En Marche, and Le Pen's Rassemblement National. Those are really the two groups that we're honing in on the most this evening, as they're the likeliest to reach that runoff. Pécresse will be hoping to attract voters from the centre and centre-right into a conservative coalition, but with voters on the far right favouring Le Pen and Zemmour, this coalition faces an uphill challenge. Not likely.
Yeah, so those are pretty much the main candidates in this French presidential election that the French people go to the polls on Sunday, and they always go to the polls. Just want to give you a little bit of a kind of the technicalities of how the French presidential elections work. So the first round of the election will take place on this Sunday, April the 10th. The two top candidates then face a face-off against each other for a second round runoff on Sunday the 24th of April. But if one of the candidates has a huge majority, then there's no need for a second round. But I don't think it's ever happened or hasn't happened for a very long time. So it's unlike in the UK, where our head of state is the monarch and is determined by hereditary succession, the French president is chosen by the people in a two-round election. And the first round is open to all candidates, provided they have received 500 signatures from national or local elected officials. If no candidate receives a majority of the votes in the first round, which is usually the case, then the voting proceeds to a runoff between the two most popular candidates. Certainly happened 5 years ago. The candidate who receives the most votes in the runoff will become president of the French Republic approximately 1 month later at an inauguration ceremony. This year's inauguration ceremony is expected to take place on May the 13th, 2022. So that's technically how the French presidential elections are carried out.
We're reminded by Elizabeth that Emmanuel Macron comes from Klaus Schwab's Young Global Leaders School, so that's related to the World Economic Forum.
And he was a banker with the Rothschilds before that, and then he was in the previous President Hollande's finance minister, so someone who's clearly been groomed for this position to take on the leadership of Europe. There's even pictures of comparing Macron with Jesus walking across the Sea of Galilee, saying that, you know, he's the new awaited Messiah of Europe, but that's turned very, very sour. Well, and also the French media described him as being the kind of Jupiter. They described him as being a god amongst men, and
Jupiter, king of the gods. 2017, but it didn't last long. It didn't last long because it was tainted just 1 year later in November 2018 with this 5-month yellow vest protest that we were speaking of earlier, which featured mock guillotines and dummies of both he and his 68-year-old wife, their heads
embarrassing, isn't it?
Appearing on spikes with banners that read "Crisis Death to the King." So we go from Jupiter, king of the gods, to crisis death to
politics for you.
There it is. So, you know, basically what we're considering here, Simon, is in many ways a repeat of 5 years ago, but with a lot more at stake. There's a lot more clarity on who these candidates are. There's a lot more that's happened in those 5 years than probably any of us could have ever imagined would happen. And this is going to be very, very key to even the future of the EU.
Absolutely, that's why we're discussing it tonight. So let's go to an interview that I did last night at 11 o'clock. So I was looking a bit tired. This is the only time that I could get hold of my very special guest for tonight's Behind the Headlines. Joined on Behind the Headlines by Dr. Glenn Fedder, who is an expert in anti-Semitism, but also spent a lot of time in France and knows the political situation very well. Glenn, warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And Glenn, what do you make of this current French presidential election 2022, with less than a week to go before the first round of voting, where the French people get the opportunity to decide who will be their next president?
Yeah, well, it's an exciting election. There are huge stakes involved. I think it's a very hard election to call, because, we have to remember it's been around 2 decades since, Mitterrand, since, a president has been re-elected. So, the French tend to be very critical with their leaders, and very rarely do they re-elect them for a second term. But at the same time, Macron is, according to the polls at least, he's at around 27%, so he's leading the second runner, Le Pen, by over 7%, for what the polls are worth.
And Glenn, can you just give us the context of this election? What are the main issues that are really on the hearts of French voters as they come to decide whether to re-elect Macron or to actually go with a huge gamble and possibly elect Marine Le Pen?
Yeah, well, I mean, the issues have evolved, really. In the beginning, let's say around 6-7 months ago, and before, the main issue was the pandemic and the economic impacts of the pandemic, and the measures that the French government was taking to deal with the pandemic, and also, that tied in generally with the economic issues. There was a giant protest movement, the Yellow Vest, the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, which Macron had to deal with for quite a while before the pandemic, and even after the pandemic. So that was the main issue. And now, of course, this war, the war of Russia, back in Ukraine, that's become a central issue as well.
And Glenn, I have to kind of ask you, because not only the future of France is at stake at this presidential election, but also the future of Europe. How has Macron gone down with the French public, knowing that he is such a federalist in terms of believing in the European dream, believing in the creation of a European superstate, and being very pro-EU, when there's a lot of growing resentment towards the European Union in France? So how is his standing going? How he's positioning himself to be the next dominant leader of the European Union?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the issues that's weakening him, as more and more Eurosceptics emerge in France, after Brexit, and given the weak kind of links of the European Union that have emerged, even during the pandemic. We've seen how some of the kinks in the armor of the EU during the pandemic. I think Macron has lost a lot of potential votes in his position, which is a stronger EU position. And look at the evidence. Le Pen is, she's at her highest. Marine Le Pen is at her highest ratings in history, I believe. So this is unprecedented, really, and so I think that is going to be one of the key kind of pivotal issues the campaign that. And, you know, one thing that I forgot to mention is the immigration issue, which we can also discuss, but immigration is obviously a point of, you know, it's tied in with the EU issue, and it's a point of great difference between the two, you know, main forerunners of this election.
And Glenn, when you look at the kind of newspapers reports, particularly reporting on the French presidential election 2022, what is coming out is there's a lot of news articles suggesting that Marine Le Pen is surging in the polls, knowing that there is an underbelly of anti-Semitism within a former party, the National Front. Are you concerned that she has generally reformed in her political opinions and her outlook from her father? Or do you think that this is all kind of deception and that the French people will wake up too late?
Yeah, well, I mean, she's at, according to most polls, she's at around 20.3%, you know, whereas Macron is at around 27.6%. So she's, you know, she's a pretty strong second runner. You know, she renamed the party, you know, a while back to National Rally, and is trying to distance herself from some of the rhetoric, or perhaps not even rhetoric, some of the ideology of her father. I don't believe the party has fundamentally changed. I think that she softened and adapted in order to, you know, in order to gain more votes. I think, you know, if we want someone who is on the right and is certainly not anti-Semitic, then we have to look at someone like Evan Seymour, who certainly made a lot of headlines over the past year, and could surprise us. I do believe that Seymour is going to get a lot more votes than the polls say. He's at around 10%, but I think he's kind of similar to Trump, where, remember when they were trying to call the election in the United States, and Trump was, you know, the polls were saying that he was very far off, and I think the reason why is because people weren't admitting that they were going to vote for Trump. And I think we're going to be surprised with him more. I think he's going to get a lot more than 10%, although I think he's going to have a hard time winning this election.
And Glenn, can you just tell us a little bit more of the format of the French presidential elections? As far as I understand it, there's one round where there are lots of candidates vying to be president, and then it's narrowed down, is it, to two candidates for the second round, and whoever wins that second round then becomes president. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if there is a second round, you know, if there's a majority vote on the first round, then it could stop at that. But usually there's a second round, and the winner of the second round becomes the president, and they have a 5-year term, which is which they can renew for another 5 years if they win the second election, of course. Yeah.
And I have to really ask you that, say, for example, Marine Le Pen won the French presidential elections. I mean, she's in the past talked about France having its own Frexit, and following on with Britain's move to pull out of the European Union. She's also then talked about the possibility of pulling France out of NATO as well. Do you think that if she won the presidency, we would see such a kind of radical policies in France that France could actually have a referendum on its membership of the European Union?
Absolutely. I mean, if she actually won the election, there would certainly be a referendum. I don't know if it would actually go through or not. I don't know if there's the same kind of sentiment as in UK towards the EU and France. I think it would be a tougher sell, a full kind of withdrawal from the EU. But it's possible, and certainly that's something that she would push for, and she hasn't been shy about saying that.
And also, what would the future of the EU look like if the French elect Marine Le Pen and she then pushes through a referendum on France's membership of the EU? Surely that could actually then break up the whole entire European project, could it not?
Absolutely. I mean, France is one of the cornerstones of the EU, and I think if that were to happen, yeah, that could be perhaps that would be. I mean, already Brexit was historic, but I think um, if there was a Frexit, then it would certainly break up a huge block of the EU and perhaps even cause a kind of domino effect where other countries would start breaking off as well. That we could see that in our lifetime.
Also, we see that the European federalists are really pinning their hopes on Macron, also winning a second term as well, in order to push forward the federalist plans to create a European superstate. We see that he's the front runner in calling for the establishment of a European army that will, of course, undermine NATO in Europe and European security. But that would be one bigger step towards a United States of Europe. Is this coming into the minds of the French voters, would you say, at this presidential election?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the really part of the future of the EU is at stake here, because if Macron wins the election, the EU is going to go in one direction. It's going to be probably enlarged, strengthened in some ways, where they're going to attempt to strengthen it, create more, especially more military, I think, cooperation, economic, and political and social. So there's going to be a strengthening effort, whereas the opposite is going to happen if Le Pen wins. So I think Simon, is zeroing in on one of the major stakes of this election, which is perhaps the future of the EU.
Which is such a big question. But when it comes down to issues such as France, such as the problems of social cohesion, we're seeing over recent years a massive rise of Islamic extremism and terrorist attacks in France, rising crime, economic problems, rising inflation, energy bills. And he also talks about the kind of draconian COVID-19 measures that Macron put in place. Surely all of these are beginning to cause a lot of resentment amongst the French public. So does he really think he can win?
I think he does. Whether that is a reality or not is another question. I mean, I know for a fact, being based in France, that he's under an enormous amount of pressure. Especially the diesel tax that he passed, created a havoc in French society. There were protests, and then the way he handled COVID by, creating these very kind of draconian blanket restrictions throughout France with the pass sanitaire and, things like that. This is going to lose him a lot of votes. A lot of French are tired of being told, what kind of, these, French, remember, this is the land of the French Revolution. They still have very much a revolutionary, independent spirit. And when you tell them, what kind of drugs they need to put in their body, it doesn't go well with a lot of French. There are even entire towns in France that have boycotted the pass sanitaire, the health pass. So, this is going to lose Macron a lot of votes, whether it'll be enough to actually give Le Pen a leg up is something we're going to see very soon.
And finally, Glenn, we saw that a few years ago that Emmanuel Macron promised that he would tackle the major problem of the rise of Islamic extremism in France, and saying how this actually threatened the very foundations of the French Republic. Is he losing that war? And is Marine Le Pen in a position to exploit that?
Yes. The answer is yes. He is losing that war. I think there's no way to really win that war unless you approach the key issue, which is immigration, because without really making immigration reforms to use a Greek analogy, you're just cutting the head off the Hydra, you know, the ancient Greek animal. You cut the head off and just another head grows. And so, you know, these attacks that have been happening, you know, over the past, you know, decade and a half, really, in France, they're not going to stop unless you really get to the source of the problem, and that means you know, radical restrictions on or reforms, let's say on immigration. That's where Zemmour is really zeroed in, and look how, you know, look at the reaction. I mean, he hit a nerve. You know, he's definitely hit a nerve. Whether he has a chance of winning or not is definitely debatable. But I think that, you know, many of the French realize that, you know, they're going to have to bite the bullet and you know, really initiate serious immigration reforms if they're going to really fight this war properly. And Macron, I don't think, in the eyes of most French people, is willing to really go as far as it takes to do that.
Dr. Glenn Fedder, thank you so much for joining us in an airport in the Caribbean. Interesting on your flight to Turkey. Pray that you have a safe flight there, and really appreciate your time in joining us today on Behind the Headlines.
Thank you, Simon. Keep up the great work.
Well, thank you very much to Simon and Glenn for that very helpful interview there. We have some emails. We are live and interactive this evening. Jay says, hi, some French political pundits are tipping Le Pen for the win. Many researchers have exposed the influence of the World Economic Forum and the governments of the West, and it's no surprise Macron has links to this ultra-globalist organization. Dave asks, are the votes hand-counted or electronically? How are the votes counted? Well, Dave, my understanding is that in France they are primarily manual and hand-counted. That's how it's done in general in France, using paper and manual counting. So hopefully that answers your question there.
It's similar to ours then.
Yeah, it sounds
I like the American system. With the dodgy ballots.
Yeah, well, each place seems to, every state has its own weird way of doing things sometimes. Anita says, it's lovely to see you both. As with all elections, it's difficult to know who would get the best leader. Is it a case of the devil you know? Macron's rivals apparently are accusing him of focusing on the Ukraine invasion to avoid problems closer to home, like riots in Corsica. Le Pen was put on trial last year for inciting anti-Semitic violence against a Jewish pop star. She was acquitted, but apparently it was a very distasteful Holocaust comment. Zemmour, the Jewish candidate, has been accused of indecent crimes against a group of 8 women. It's hard to know the truth sometimes. I wouldn't know who to vote for. It's one of those things that we have to pray about and really consider.
Well, France is so ultra-secular anyway. Yeah. So, you know, we think our politics is bad, but theirs is particularly bad. And also when you think that we've got our own problems with Boris and Partygate and everything else, but in France, I think they're more serious problems than what that we have here.
We have this back from Digby. Yes, I will be voting this Sunday at a designated location. Good to hear. He says, we do not consider the collaborators French. The French government was in exile in the UK. The collaborators were working with the Nazis and not for France. It's a fair point. Marine Le Pen is for France, whereas Macron is so pro-EU and will wither France's sovereignty, especially with his European army. And by the way, Eric Zemmour is himself Jewish and from Algeria. French politics is like a southern French fish stew, a mix of everything. The fish stew is probably nice. I don't know about the politics.
The French food is always good in France.
So here's another question. Am I right in thinking Macron introduced the passe sanitaire for health workers? Also, is Marie Le Pen pro-life and generally supportive of Christian values? Sorry, I joined the program late. Yes, Macron is, as I understand it, responsible for the passe sanitaire. And no, well, Marine Le Pen is very unclear in her exact position on the pro-life issue. She would continue to support abortion remaining legal, at least at this point. That's what she's indicated. indicated she opposes attempts to abolish public subsidies for abortion, but she has commented that abortion is a very serious moral issue that she feels is too often regarded as trivial by French society. And one of her nieces, Marine Len Pen, is very actively opposed to abortion. So there's that.
She did say she's campaigning on traditional family values, so you have to make that as you were. I mean, she did say this one, for example. She says that I'm like the phoenix arising from the ashes. We feel it on the ground. There is a great dynamic, a hope that is emerging as the campaign near its end. I said on one of her many visits to a market this time in eastern France. What people said was the automatic re-election of Emmanuel Macron has turned out to be fake news. He said it's perfectly possible to defeat Emmanuel Macron and radically change the politics of this country. So there we go. And at the moment, a recent poll was for Le Monde in France has found that 46% of the French now see it as representing a patriotic right attached to traditional values, with only 40% seeing a harking from the racist, xenophobic far-right party, and that's a 9% drop since 2019. So clearly her party and herself have gone through a massive image transformation, which you need.
They have.
Politics.
And yet she remains Eurosceptic to a degree personally, and the policies still go completely against the EU's values in many ways. She desires French law to have primacy over European legislation.
Which is not compatible with the European Union. So that's another word of saying, I want out of the EU. Exactly.
She's broadcast messages of support from the likes of Viktor Orban, Hungary's populist prime minister, who as we talked about earlier, is just won a fourth term. She's very opposed to wind farms and wants more support for nuclear energy, which currently fuels some 70% of France's electricity needs, and hydrogen. She promises to reclaim control of borders from the EU. Again, something that, I mean, practically, Simon, as we begin to wind this down, it looks like we're talking about a potential Frexit here.
Yes. But I mean, this is what she campaigned on 5 years ago, to pull France out of NATO, to pull France out of the European Union. But at that election, she had the funding and support from Putin. And that's where her money was coming from. Because under French law, the National Front Party weren't able to raise funds and to campaign in France, so they had to have outside funding. That came from Putin, because Putin saw it as his advantage to support nationalist political parties, to undermine NATO and to undermine the European Union.
How much do you think that will hurt her in this election?
It doesn't seem to have hurt her at all. Because I think at the moment it's like, you know, it's like the famous US President Bill Clinton, when he won the '92 election, he says it's the economy, stupid. Yeah. So it's what people are hurting in their pockets right now with rising inflation, rising energy prices. The French people are saying this is hurting, I want to vote in my self-interest. So she's able to capitalise on that, and maybe she will in the second round, who knows. But if Macron doesn't start campaigning, he could lose this election.
She said that they're not going to leave the euro, though. Is that correct?
She said that. But I think she's saying these things in order to show a moderation to centralist French people that may be concerned that this may have a huge economic impact on her. Reagan, great to do a programme with you tonight. Likewise. As we discuss the French presidential elections that are taking place this Sunday, the first round.
We need to pray about it, don't we?
Of course. So, yeah, we need to pray about these French presidential elections, because not only is the destiny of France a state, but also that of the European Union. If Macron wins, then it's a full acceleration into a European superstate. And if Marine Le Pen wins the biggest political shock of this century, then this is a break on moves towards European federalism. So we can see Bible prophecy unfold. I want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines. We need to stay ahead of the news so we know what's going on. So thank you for watching tonight's Behind Headlines.